The sky over Dry Creek pressed low and gray, swollen with rain that had not yet fallen. Wind raced across the ridge and bent the tall grass until it whispered like restless ghosts. At the center of town, beside the warped timbers of the churchyard fence, a crowd had gathered in a restless half-circle. Hats pulled low, skirts clutched in fists, eyes sharp yet unwilling to linger too long. They were waiting for the deacon. They were waiting for punishment. Hannah Pierce stood barefoot in the mud, her thin dress clinging to her frame as if the cloth itself wished to shield her and could not. She did not plead. She did not cry. Her hands stayed bound in front of her, raw from the rope. The marks across her back were already darkening, though the lash had only begun. Each crack carried over the silence like thunder striking the earth. The murmurs of the crowd rose and fell with every blow, some with satisfaction, others with unease, but none with compassion strong enough to intervene. Deacon Silas Greer loomed like a black tower, his voice booming scripture twisted into judgment. "The wages of fruitlessness is shame," he declared, spittle catching in the wind. "A widow who cannot bear is a curse upon the land." His hand lifted again, and though the sound followed sharp, the violence itself lived only in the flinches and turned faces of those watching. The people stared at the ground, at the boards of the church, at anything but the woman whose flesh bore the cost of their silence. Rain finally came, soft at first, beating on foreheads, gathering in hairlines, tracing lines of mud down already damp cheeks. Hannah sagged against the post, breath shuddering, her lips moving without sound. Perhaps prayer, perhaps memory. One man did not look away. Jonah Merrick stood apart from the others, his broad shoulders set beneath a worn brown coat, the brim of his hat dripping. He had not come for judgment, though he had heard the whispers in the mercantile, the ugly talk of barrenness, of punishment dressed as piety. He had come because something in him had grown restless, some part of him weary of seeing cruelty paraded as righteousness. His 3 children waited at home, warm by the stove, and he thought of them now, their small faces, their questions he never quite answered. When at last Silas lowered the whip and let the silence settle, the deacon's voice rang out once more, colder than the wind. "By authority of the church, Hannah Pierce is cast from this fellowship. By sundown, she shall be gone from Dry Creek. To remain is to invite further wrath." A rustle moved through the crowd like brush fire. Relief for some, unease for others. No one stepped forward. No one untied the rope. Jonah moved. He walked past the deacon, past the murmuring townsfolk, and slipped his coat from his shoulders. The heavy wool smelled faintly of cedar and smoke. He draped it across Hannah's trembling frame, hiding the stripes, shielding her from their eyes. His hand lingered just long enough for her to know it was no pity but respect. He said nothing. Judgment had filled the air long enough. Hannah lifted her face. Rain streaked her cheeks clean. In her eyes was not gratitude, not yet, but the fragile spark of someone who had been seen. Behind them, Silas Greer's voice cracked again, but this time it was not thunder. It was the dry rasp of a man who believed his word to be final. "Banished by sundown," he repeated, his gaze cutting to Jonah with suspicion sharp as steel. The crowd began to disperse, boots squelching in the mud, whispers trailing like smoke. Only Jonah remained by her side, and only Hannah remained with nothing but the weight of the coat, the sound of the lash still echoing, and the knowledge that the sun was already lowering toward the horizon. The road out of Dry Creek stretched like a scar through the land, beaten flat by wagon wheels and weather. Hannah Pierce moved along it as though each step was a sentence, her feet sinking into the damp earth where the rain had left its mark. The sky above was bruised, clouds swollen and heavy, pressing low enough that the air itself felt like weight on her shoulders. Her back burned with every motion, the stripes raw and hot beneath the wool coat Jonah Merrick had laid across her, but she would not let herself collapse. Dignity had narrowed to a rhythm one step, then another. Her breath came ragged but steady. She did not look back at the town. She could still hear the murmur of voices, see in her mind the turned faces, the averted eyes of people she had once prayed beside. The lashes had cut her skin, but it was the silence that had cut deeper. They had watched her fall, and none had moved to lift her, except one. Ahead, the land opened into a wide plain, broken only by fence lines and the crooked spines of cottonwood trees. At the crest of a rise, she stopped to steady herself, clutching the coat tighter around her body. That was when she saw them. 3 small figures standing on the fence rail like sparrows on a wire, watching her from the edge of the Merrick homestead. The oldest boy, Tom, 10 if she guessed right, balanced on the middle rail, his elbows hooked over the top. Beside him, Wren, all sharp angles and bright eyes, whispered something Hannah could not hear. Little Josie, her hair a pale tangle, clung to the post with both hands, her chin resting just above the wood. They watched the stranger stumble along the road with solemn faces too old for their years. Their father emerged from the barn a moment later, tall and broad, moving with the steadiness of a man long used to shouldering more than his share. Jonah Merrick. The name sat in Hannah's mind, though she had never spoken it aloud. She saw him tug a saddle onto a bay horse, his motions efficient, unhurried, as though he had already made his decision long before she crested the ridge. By the time she drew near, her legs shaking, he was mounted, reins in one hand and a small parcel slung across the saddle horn. He did not greet her with questions or judgment. Instead, he reached into the parcel and drew out a tin cup. The steam from coffee rose into the damp air, bitter and rich. He offered it down to her without ceremony. "Drink," he said. The warmth burned her hands before it soothed her throat, but she drank, steadying herself on the stirrup leather. When she handed the cup back, he pulled out a jar wrapped in cloth, the faint smell of herbs and resin escaping into the wind. "Salve," he muttered. "For the stripes." She wanted to thank him, but the words stuck. So she only nodded, clutching the coat tighter as though it might hold her upright. Jonah looked at her the way a man looks at a storm cloud, assessing, not fearful, but knowing the damage it might carry. His voice came low, rough as gravel. "I don't care what they say you did. I care what you need." The simplicity of it undid something in her. For the first time since the lash, she felt the press of tears, though none fell. "I need a place to breathe," she whispered. He gave a single nod. "Then you'll have it." The horse shifted, ears flicking, and Jonah's gaze lifted past her shoulder. Hannah turned slowly, the pain in her back making her wince. On the ridge behind them, another horse had appeared, dark against the gray horizon. The rider sat tall in the saddle, hat low, shoulders broad. Even from the distance, she knew the swagger. Buck Harlan, Deacon Silas Greer's favored man, the one who carried notices and threats with equal ease. The sound of his hoofbeats carried through the damp air, steady and closing. Jonah's jaw tightened, but he did not reach for the rifle tied to his saddle. He only shifted the reins in his hand and looked at Hannah, his eyes steady beneath the brim of his hat. "Best keep walking," he said. "Storm's not done yet." The Merrick kitchen was a small square of warmth against the gray day outside. The stove hissed with a steady rhythm, copper kettle breathing steam into the air, the smell of beans and wood smoke lingering thick. Tin mugs rattled faintly against the scarred tabletop as Jonah set them down, one before Hannah and the others at his children's usual places. The children themselves were quiet, unusually so, as if some silent pact bound their tongues. Tom leaned his elbows on the table, jaw tight. Wren's eyes flicked from Hannah to her father, curious but wary. Little Josie sat on her knees on the bench, thumb lodged firmly in her mouth, watching everything as though she might solve the silence herself. Hannah sat stiff, both hands wrapped around the mug Jonah had given her, though she hadn't sipped. Her back ached with every small shift, the stripes searing even through the coat. She focused on the hiss of the stove, on the faint drip of water from the eaves outside, anything but the way the children's eyes pressed against her. Jonah stood at the counter for a long moment, one hand braced against the wood, his face unreadable in the dim light. Then he turned, leaned his weight on the chair opposite hers, and spoke with the same bluntness he carried into every chore. "I'll say it plain," he began, his voice steady but low. "You can't walk Dry Creek alone. Not after what Silas did. Not with Harlan shadowing your steps. They'll keep coming unless you're bound to a man's roof." Hannah stiffened. "You're saying—" "I'm saying a marriage," Jonah cut in. "Not for love, not for vows you don't mean. Just protection. My name on the ledger, my word on the door. They'll think twice before they try to drag you back once it's written down. You'll have walls no one can breach." The words hung heavy in the warm kitchen. The children shifted, Tom scowling as though he understood more than his years allowed, Wren's lips parting in surprise, Josie's thumb slipping free just long enough to ask in a small voice, "She'll stay?" Jonah didn't answer her. His gaze stayed locked on Hannah, unflinching. Hannah's fingers tightened on the mug. A marriage. The word struck like another lash, carrying weight she thought she'd buried with her late husband. Her body trembled, not from cold, but from the sudden rush of choice. She lifted her chin, though her voice quivered. "If I agree, I keep my own name. At least for now. And I work for my keep every meal, every chore, same as anyone. I won't be taken in as pity." Jonah's brow furrowed slightly, but he nodded once. "Fair." She hesitated, then added, softer, "And no one touches the scars, not until I say." Her eyes dropped to the tabletop, cheeks coloring with the admission. Jonah's voice carried no judgment when he replied, "No one will." For the first time since the whipping, she let out a breath that wasn't ragged. Something like relief flickered in her chest, fragile but real. She glanced at the children, who seemed to ease as if some invisible tension had loosened. Tom leaned back, arms crossed, but his scowl had softened. Wren smiled faintly, and Josie clapped her small hands together once before returning to silence. Jonah reached for his hat on the table, preparing to fetch Elvira Boone as witness. But before he could lift it, a thunderous pounding rattled the door. The mugs quivered on the wood, steam curling up like smoke from a fire. The children startled, Josie pressing back against her sister. Jonah straightened, eyes narrowing, but it was Hannah who froze hardest, her grip clamped white on the mug. From outside came a familiar drawl, rough and mocking. "Open up, Merrick, by order of Deacon Silas Greer." Another slam shook the frame. Paper rustled against the wood. Notice signed and sealed. Widow Pierce to be remanded to church custody. You've no claim on her. The pounding came again, louder this time, echoing through the small house until even the kettle on the stove seemed to shiver. Inside, no one moved, not even to breathe. The dawn was still only a suggestion when Jonah saddled the bay and lifted Hannah up behind him. The world was cold, the air damp with a mist that clung to their hair and lashes. They rode with little sound beyond the horse's steady rhythm and the distant cry of a hawk rising over the ridge. Hannah kept her hands tight around the worn leather of the saddle, her back stiff against the ache of healing wounds. Neither of them spoke much. Jonah's silence was not avoidance, but something heavier, like a man measuring every word before it left him. By the time the courthouse in Fairlight came into view, the sun had barely cracked the horizon, casting the small town in pale silver. Magistrate Abel Crane was a wiry man with eyes that missed little, and a hand that trembled slightly as he dipped his quill into ink. He didn't ask questions beyond what was necessary. The form was plain, the words spare. Names, dates, marks. Jonah signed first, his script slow and careful, the letters carved with weight. When the quill passed to Hannah, her hand faltered. For a moment, the ink blotched, trembling on the page, and she almost set it down. But then she pressed on, wrote her name with a thin, defiant line, and let it dry. The magistrate's seal came down with a finality that seemed to echo in the stillness. They left with the record folded into Jonah's coat pocket. It was not a love story, not the kind Hannah had once dreamed of when she was a girl staring out windows. But it was protection, something sturdy to shield her from the storm of judgment. That would have to be enough. Back at the homestead, firelight softened the edges of the room. The stove crackled with new logs, the flames throwing shadows against the plank walls. Jonah kept his distance, unrolling an old pallet for Hannah on the far side of the room. Between them, he strung a blanket from beam to beam, the fabric hanging limp like a fragile wall. It was not privacy, not really, but it was dignity, and that counted more than she could say. The children watched her with the sharp eyes of those who had learned the world could change overnight. Tom sat at the table, whittling a stick into shavings, his suspicion thick as the curls of wood piling at his feet. Wren lingered nearby, voice cautious when she finally asked, "Do you know how to stitch horsetack, or only clothes?" Hannah answered carefully, "Both, if the leather's good." Wren nodded as though testing a puzzle piece that nearly fit. Josie stayed quiet, thumb tucked in her mouth, gaze fixed on Hannah with an intensity that made her chest tighten. Later, when the house had settled into the rhythm of evening, Hannah sat near the fire with needle and thread, mending a tear in one of Tom's shirts. Each sound made her flinch: the snap of firewood, the scrape of Jonah's chair, the slam of the barn door outside when the wind caught it. Her hands never stopped working, but her shoulders stayed high, as if braced for something else to fall. Jonah noticed, though he said nothing. He sat with his elbows on his knees, staring into the fire, the folded record safe inside his coat pocket. The flames threw light across his face, etching the lines deeper, making him look older, more burdened. Then came the sound, sharp and sudden. Glass shattered, scattering across the floor in glittering shards. Josie screamed. Wren pulled her close, and Tom leapt to his feet with the stick still clutched in his hand. Hannah's needle froze mid-stitch, her heart hammering. On the floor near the hearth lay a rock, wrapped in torn paper. Jonah picked it up, unwrapped it slowly, his face tightening as he read the scrawled words in the flicker of firelight. "Return the barren wife or face judgment." The flames crackled, throwing sparks upward, but the room was swallowed in silence. Only Hannah's breath came harsh, ragged in her throat, as the words sank like lead into the air around them. The days did not pass in leaps, but in the quiet rhythm of work that stitched themselves into something like normalcy. Morning light crept through the thin curtains, spilling over rough plank floors, and Hannah rose with it, shoulders stiff but hands already reaching for the kettle. She learned the shape of the Merrick homestead through its chores. The sound of the pump handle groaning at dawn, the smell of the goats when they crowded close to be milked, the way the bay mare stamped her hooves when the children came too near with nervous laughter. Hannah moved among it all with a steadiness that surprised even her. The scars on her back pulled and burned with each bend, each lift, but she gritted against the pain and did not let it slow her. When the mare shied at thunder, Hannah laid a palm against the long neck and hummed a tune half remembered from her childhood. The low sound filled the stall, steady and calm, and soon the animal's quivering eased. Tom, watching from the fence, blinked as if he'd seen a trick of magic. He said nothing, only hopped down and set to mending the latch she had pointed out with a faint smile. In the house, when Josie's cough deepened at night, Hannah set a kettle on the stove, draping cloths to catch the steam and carry it toward the child's bed. She sat awake beside her, spooning honey water between small lips until the rasp settled into softer breaths. At dawn, when Jonah entered, eyes heavy from his own nights watching the stock, he found Josie curled peacefully beneath her quilt and Hannah still upright in the chair, her hair damp from steam, her gaze steady despite the shadows under her eyes. Wren hovered closest of the three, curiosity outweighing suspicion. One afternoon she brought her tangles of hair and sat cross-legged on the floor at Hannah's feet. "Show me," she asked, thrusting a comb into Hannah's hand. Hannah obliged, careful and patient, teaching the girl to separate strands into even thirds, to pull firm but not harsh, to tie the end with string. Wren grinned at her reflection in the darkened window, delighted at the braid trailing over her shoulder. Tom held out the longest, stiff with the pride of being the oldest, the one who remembered their mother most. But even he faltered when Hannah found his slingshot cracked clean through the fork. Instead of scolding, she fetched twine and a thin strip of leather, binding it together with care. When she handed it back, he tested the pull and found it stronger than before. His cheeks colored when she praised the fence line he'd mended by the barn. He only muttered, "It'll hold now," before hurrying outside, but the look on his face lingered long after. Jonah watched it all with the quiet of a man remembering how to breathe after too long holding his lungs shut. He saw Hannah move through his house not as a ghost or a guest, but as someone weaving herself into the grain of it. The firelight caught her face in the evenings, her hands busy with stitching or kneading dough, and he felt something shift in him, slow, reluctant, but undeniable. It was on such an evening, the children dozing near the hearth, that a knock came. Mrs. Elvira Boone stood in the doorway, shawl drawn tight, her eyes sharp beneath her bonnet. She stepped in, lowered her voice, and set a folded scrap of newsprint on the table. "Word from town," she said. "Silas Greer's gone to the circuit court. Claims this marriage of yours is fraud. Says it ought to be annulled." The fire cracked loud in the silence that followed. Hannah's hands stilled on the fabric she'd been stitching. Jonah's jaw tightened. Outside, the wind rattled the shutters like bones. The church in Dry Creek stood crooked at its foundation, boards weathered gray by years of wind and grit. Inside, though, its air smelled not of mercy, but of mildew and ink. The shelves in the back room sagged with heavy ledgers bound in cracked leather, each page lined with the neat hand of Deacon Silas Greer. They were not the books of heaven he so often preached from, but records of men and their supposed sins, tallied and marked as if the keeping of accounts could weigh a soul. Hannah stood in that dim room with her breath shallow, her fingers brushing the edge of one such volume. It had taken her days to find the courage, and the absence of the deacon that afternoon had given her the chance. She turned pages slowly, scanning names she knew, neighbors she had nodded to on market days, each one attached to some offense, petty or cruel, written in Silas's unwavering script. She found her own soon enough. The letters carved across the page struck harder than any lash. "Widow Pierce. Offense, infertile." Beneath it, a note in the margin, confirmed by Pierce family testimony. Her chest tightened. It was not enough they had whipped her body. They had branded her in ink, a judgment preserved in paper that would outlast breath. The word glared at her, bold as a scar. She pressed the ledger closed, hands trembling, and slid it back into its place. For a moment, she swayed where she stood, the shame almost knocking her to her knees. But then a sharper thought rose through the haze. If this was written, perhaps it could be unwritten. Truth might yet claw its way into the light. The answer came not in the church, but in town, where the doctor's wagon rattled over the dust. Dr. Lyle Hemsworth was a thin, road-worn man, with spectacles perched perpetually low on his nose and a bag heavy with instruments. He greeted Jonah by the livery and looked twice when he saw Hannah standing nearby. "I remember you," he said, then paused. "No, not you. Your late husband. Saw him near 2 years back, though he claimed it was only a passing ailment." Hannah's stomach coiled. What ailment? The doctor adjusted his spectacles, lowering his voice, though no one lingered close. "Weakness of seed," he murmured. "A condition that left no chance of children. He begged my discretion. I gave it. But if someone claimed otherwise, if they said you bore fault, then they lied." The world tilted around her, the street spinning with the noise of wagon wheels and merchant cries. She wanted to laugh, to weep, to crumble all at once. All those lashes, all that shame, all because of a lie that had been written down like gospel. Here stood a witness, living and breathing, who could undo it. Jonah's jaw flexed as he listened, the muscle working like stone grinding stone. He thanked the doctor and placed a steadying hand against Hannah's back, guiding her away before her knees gave out. For the first time, she allowed herself to lean into the touch. But hope came with its shadow. When they reached the homestead again, the sheriff was already waiting, nailing paper to the post outside the gate. Sheriff Maddox had once been fair, but coin had a way of bending a man's spine, and Silas's purse was heavy enough to buy him whole. He hammered the last nail with slow precision, then turned, his face expressionless under the brim of his hat. "Summons for Widow Pierce," he said, voice flat. "To appear before the circuit court. Claims of fraud need answering." His gaze flicked to Jonah, cool and deliberate. "And you, Merrick, there's talk of harboring a fallen woman. Men in town say a father who does such loses the right to keep his own. Custody can shift easy when the law says it should." The paper flapped in the wind, stark against the post. Hannah's name stared back at her, black on white, a summons meant to strip her again. Jonah's children clung to the fence, silent, eyes wide. The sheriff tipped his hat and rode off, dust rising behind him. Hannah stood rooted, her stomach hollow. Jonah tore the notice free, crumpled it in his hand, and stared into the distance where the sheriff had gone. His voice came low, more iron than she had yet heard from him. "They'll not take you, and they'll not take my children, not while I stand." But even as he spoke, the threat in the words on that paper burned like fire between them. The summons sat folded on the table for 3 days, its edges softening under Jonah's restless hands. He rode to town once, trying the lawful road, speaking with a lawyer whose pockets were already padded by Silas Greer. The man coughed into his hand and said little beyond. "The deacon's influence is strong, Merrick, stronger than truth." Jonah returned grim and silent, the weight of failure pressing into his shoulders. Hannah watched the way his jaw clenched when he looked at the children, the way he turned away from her as if ashamed, but she did not flinch. She had known all along that the law here bent to men who wrote it for themselves. When the sound of hoofbeats broke over the ridge on the 4th morning, she already knew whose shadow would fall first. Buck Harlan rode at the head of 2 men, their dust rising like storm clouds, their rifles slung easy at their sides. The sun struck their coats until the buttons gleamed like small coins of fire. Hannah felt her stomach twist, but her hands were steady as she stepped outside. She had no tears left. Her back was straight, her breath even, the rifle Jonah kept by the door resting low in her grip. The children were in the loft, peering through the narrow cracks of the barn wall, their faces pale and round against the dark wood. Wren held Josie's small hand. Tom crouched with his eyes hard, watching everything. They did not speak, but Hannah felt them there, their small hopes pressed against her spine like prayers. Buck reined in 10 paces from the porch, spitting into the dust before speaking. "Got no quarrel with you, Merrick, but she comes with us. You can't keep what the church has claimed." Jonah stepped out beside Hannah, his stance wide, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol but not drawing. "She's my wife," he said evenly. "Paper signed, record sealed." Buck's laugh was sharp as a breaking stick. "Silas says that record's fraud. A barren woman can't build a house. She can't keep the Lord's blessing on land." Hannah's voice cut clean through the air. Better barren than cruel. She lifted the rifle, not high, not in threat, but enough that every man in the yard saw her spine would not bend again. The silence that followed carried weight, the kind that pressed ears and hearts alike. Then came the shuffle of steps behind, slow and deliberate. "Mrs." Elvira Boone walked up the road with her shawl pulled tight, her eyes steady. The blacksmith, Jory Miles, followed, shoulders broad as the anvil he worked every day. Agnes Thorne, the midwife, set her small frame between them, her gaze fixed on Hannah with quiet defiance. They did not speak. They did not shout. They only stood there, present, their boots raising small ghosts of dust. The message was plain enough. If Silas wanted to take her, he would have to drag her from the hands of neighbors who had known the sting of his ledger too. Buck's smirk faltered, his gaze flicking from face to face. For a moment, the dust seemed to still, the sun holding its breath above them all. Then one of his men, perhaps too young or too reckless, pulled a torch from his saddlebag and struck it against the flint of his spur. The fire caught with a hungry hiss, orange flaring against the pale daylight. With a wild shout, he hurled it toward the barn. The torch spun once, twice, before it struck dry hay. Flames leapt like blossoms bursting open, curling fast into the wind. The children's cries cut through the air as smoke curled upward, black against the blue. The standoff shattered into chaos, and the night began before the sun had even set. The torch's flame spread with a hunger that turned dry hay into a furnace. Smoke poured from the cracks in the barn wall, thick and black, and the frightened cries of the colts inside pierced the air like blades. Jonah shouted for water, and the neighbors moved fast, Jory Miles hauling buckets from the pump, Mrs. Boone snatching up wet sacks to beat the fire back. The air filled with sparks that rained across the yard, stinging hands and cheeks. Hannah didn't wait for orders. She ran for the wagon, skirts whipping around her legs, and grabbed Josie up in one arm, Wren in the other. Tom scrambled behind, too old to be carried but too young to be safe. She heaved them onto the wagon seat, her throat already raw from smoke. The mare shied at the heat, eyes rolling white, but Hannah clutched the reins tight. With a sharp word and a steady pull, she steered the wagon away from the barn out into the open pasture where Sparks couldn't reach. Behind her, the barn roared like a living thing. Jonah and the men formed a line, throwing bucket after bucket, their arms moving with a desperate rhythm. The hiss of water on flame rose like a chorus, mingled with coughs and curses. Jonah swung a wet sack at the roofline, his shoulders straining, the heat blistering against his skin. The timbers groaned above him, a low sound that promised collapse. And then Tom broke free. He darted from the wagon, his small figure streaking across the smoke-thick yard. "The slingshot," he shouted, though no one could hear him over the roar. Hannah saw him vanish into the smoke, and her heart seized. Without a thought, she leapt down and charged after him. The barn door cracked open just enough for his thin frame to slip inside, but before the fire could swallow him whole, Hannah threw herself across the threshold, tackling him to the dirt. The roof gave a warning shriek. A beam splintered, raining sparks down around them. Hannah wrapped her arms around Tom, her own body shielding his, and dragged him across the ground. Smoke scraped her throat raw, burning her lungs with every breath. She coughed so hard she thought her chest might tear, but she did not let go until they tumbled clear of the doorway and into Jonah's arms. "Fool boy," Jonah barked, clutching Tom tight before shoving him toward the wagon. His face was streaked with soot, his eyes wet not from tears but from the sting of smoke. He turned back without pause, beating the flames again with a sack until his arms shook. By nightfall, the barn was half ruin, its roof sagging like a broken rib cage. But the walls still stood, blackened but upright. And when Jory pulled the door wide, two trembling colts stumbled out into the cool night air. Their hides were singed, but they lived. A ragged cheer rose from the neighbors, relief mingling with exhaustion. Hannah sat on the grass with her arms wrapped around Tom, her voice rasping from the smoke. Each word scraped her throat like glass, but she whispered steady, "You're safe. You're safe." He wept against her shoulder, too shaken to answer. As the embers glowed, Agnes Thorne moved closer, her apron smudged with ash. She looked not at the ruin, but at Hannah, her eyes holding something heavy. From her pocket, she drew a small envelope, edges worn but seal still intact. "I held this back," she said quietly, her voice cutting through the crackle of dying fire. "Dr. Hemsworth gave it to me before he rode on, said it was proof in case the deacon's lies grew too loud." She pressed the envelope into Hannah's soot-stained hand. Hannah stared at it, her fingers trembling. Agnes went on, softer still. "And there's more. A fund Silas has kept hidden for years, coins skimmed from every tithe. I've seen the ledger with my own eyes. The truth isn't just on paper, it's in his purse." Jonah turned, his chest still heaving, his face blackened with ash. His eyes fixed on the sealed letter, then back at Hannah. The firelight flickered across them both as the weight of what Agnes had said settled in the smoky night. Somewhere in the darkness, a beam cracked and fell, the sparks scattering into silence. The fight with flame was over, but another reckoning had begun. The one-room schoolhouse had never held so many souls at once. Its windows were propped open to let the heat spill out, but the air inside still clung thick, humming with whispers and shuffling boots. Benches meant for children now bowed under the weight of ranchers, merchants, wives, and farmhands who had left their fields untended for the sake of judgment. At the front sat the circuit judge, a stern man with heavy brows and a gavel that looked as though it had pounded through more than one hard truth. Hannah sat near Jonah, her hands folded tight in her lap, the scars across her back hidden beneath a plain dress. She could feel every gaze upon her, but for once the stares were not only sharp with suspicion, they were mixed with something else: pity, curiosity, a flicker of respect. Jonah sat straight-backed at her side, his hat on the bench beside him, his children perched on the row behind, eyes wide, faces solemn. The judge cleared his throat. The matter before this court claims of fraudulent marriage, false record, and misconduct. Let testimony be heard. His voice settled over the room like the toll of a bell. Agnes Thorne rose first. The midwife's small frame seemed to swell with purpose as she stepped forward. From her apron pocket she drew the sealed envelope and placed it carefully upon the judge's table. "Dr. Hemsworth entrusted me with this," she said. "He knew truth might be twisted by men with louder voices. It names the true cause of the Pierce line ending, and it was not Hannah Pierce." A murmur rippled through the benches. The judge broke the seal, scanning the letter in silence before nodding slowly. His eyes lifted, pinning Silas Greer where he sat stiff in the front row, his hands folded over his black coat. Then, Mrs. Elvira Boone stepped forward, spectacles perched on her nose, a heavy leather ledger tucked under her arm. She opened it to a marked page and read aloud, her voice steady despite the hush. "Widow Pierce, offense, infertile, confirmed by Pierce family testimony. Punishment, 100 stripes." She snapped the book closed with a crack. I saw those marks given. They were not discipline. They were cruelty dressed as scripture. The room shifted, a wave of discomfort passing from bench to bench. Faces turned from Silas. A woman at the back dabbed her eyes with her kerchief. One by one, townsfolk stood to speak. The blacksmith told how Hannah had soothed the colts when fire nearly took them. Wren's schoolmate's mother spoke of Hannah's quiet patience with children. Even the storekeeper admitted she had paid her debts in work and steadiness rather than coin. Each word chipped away at the wall Silas had built around her name. The door creaked open, and all heads turned as Dr. Lyle Hemsworth entered, dust on his boots, spectacles askew from travel. He went straight to the judge's table, swearing under oath what he had told Hannah in private, that her late husband had been barren long before she was blamed. "It was his ailment, not hers," Hemsworth said, his voice sharp as iron. She carried no fault but silence. Silas surged to his feet, his face red, his voice booming. "Lies, bought words. This woman brings ruin on every house that shelters her." But the judge's gavel struck once, silencing him. Finally, Jonah rose. He did not move to the front, but spoke from where he stood beside Hannah. His voice was low, calm, each word carrying farther than the shouts that had filled the room before. "I did not marry a scandal," he said. "I married a person, a woman who kept my children safe when flames rose, who worked these hands raw to make a home. If that is fraud, then perhaps truth no longer matters in Dry Creek." Silence followed, deep and heavy. Even the restless children held still. The judge looked over the room, his expression unreadable. Then, his gavel came down hard. "This court finds the marriage lawful and binding. The record stands. The deacon, Silas Greer, is hereby removed from his office and fined for misuse of authority. A warrant is issued for Buck Harlan for arson and assault. The sound of the gavel echoed through the schoolhouse, and the whispers that followed carried the weight of something breaking, something long held in fear, now cracked open to light. Hannah gripped the bench until her knuckles whitened, scarcely believing she was hearing it. Jonah's hand brushed hers, steady and sure, as Silas's face drained pale under the eyes of the people he had ruled with fear. But though the gavel had fallen, Hannah knew it was not the end. Judgment could remove a man from office, but it could not strip the bitterness from his bones. And men like Silas Greer did not fade quietly. The land softened with time, as though the harsh winds of Dry Creek had spent themselves at last. The blackened skeleton of the old barn was pulled down beam by beam, and in its place rose fresh timber, hewn by neighbors who showed up with tools and sweat. Hammers rang out in rhythm with children's laughter, the sound carrying across the fields like music. Where once there had been smoke and ruin, now stood new walls, bright with the smell of raw pine. Hannah worked her share among them, sleeves rolled to the elbow, hands steady on the saw or the plow. When the barn stood finished, she turned her energy to the ground around the house. She planted rows of beans and squash, tucked seeds into soil she whispered to, as if coaxing them to life. In one patch by the fence she placed slender saplings of almond, insisting they would one day bloom late in spring, stubborn but sure. Like us, she told Jonah when he raised a brow at the choice. Not first, not fast, but lasting. The children folded themselves into this new rhythm as naturally as seeds find root. Wren followed Hannah everywhere, learning the names of herbs, the measure of stitches, the trick of coaxing a braid tight without pulling too hard. Josie stayed close too, content on the floor with a rag doll in her lap, braiding and unbraiding its yarn hair as the adults moved about her. Tom grew taller by inches, shoulders broadening, voice deepening, but his eyes still sought Jonah's hand on tools and Hannah's praise when he straightened a fence rail. One evening, when the heat of summer had faded into a mellow dusk, the house seemed wrapped in quiet. The barn glowed golden in the last light, the garden rows lined with green promise. On the porch, Hannah settled with Wren asleep against her shoulder, the girl's breathing even and soft. Josie sat at her feet, humming as she worked knots into her doll's hair. Tom crouched nearby with a post in his hands, frowning at the angle. "How do I set it so it won't lean come winter?" he asked, leaning close, seeking the wisdom he trusted her to have. Hannah smiled faintly, brushing a strand of hair from her face, and answered with patience that made Tom nod as if she'd told him a secret worth keeping. The screen door creaked, and Jonah stepped out, 2 mugs steaming in his hands. He crossed the porch with his quiet stride and set one down beside her. He didn't kneel or bow or speak flowery words. He only stood for a moment, watching the children, watching her, then sat down beside her with a long breath. His arm brushed hers, and he let the silence stretch before breaking it. "Hannah," he said, voice steady but softer than she had ever heard it. "We've done what we had to do. But I reckon it's time to do what we want. No grand vows, no ledger, just you and me deciding. Will you begin with me for real?" Her heart tightened, not with fear but with the quiet release of a burden carried too long. She turned her head, rested it against his shoulder, and let the weight of her answer settle there. "Yes," she whispered. He didn't need more. His hand found hers, rough and warm, and for a long while they simply sat together, children gathered around them, the evening folding soft over their shoulders. Out in the yard, the almond saplings stirred in the breeze. A few pale blossoms, early and uncertain, drifted loose, tumbling across the soil like forgiveness falling from the sky. 2 grown hands and 2 small ones pressed side by side into the dirt, tucking roots into good earth, the beginning of something that would outlast them all.